Greetings once again. Chapter 19, Imperialism. The second of our isms. 1890, 1914. You notice we're overlapping the same years here, give or take a few, with imperialism and progressivism. So, the thing about this chapter, if you ever want to know why it is that the United States seems to be the country that goes around the world putting out all these fires, well, you can trace it back to the information in Chapter 19. Actually, we can go back to Monroe Doctrine, 1823. But, we picked that up, especially with Roosevelt here in Chapter 19. So let's move on. Imperial America. There's your Maine blowing up in the Havana Harbor. Remember the Maine, remember the Maine. And the Spaniards didn't even sink it. Of course, who wants to let the truth interfere with a good story? It sounded really good that the Spaniards had mined Havana Harbor and we hit one of their mines. And this, of course, is called the destruction of the U.S. battleship Maine. There was, in the 1970s, the U.S. Navy announced that it had determined that the explosion had come from on the ship. Something down in the hull of the ship. I think a boiler had exploded or something. But anywho, here we go. Imperial America, breaking it down for you. See this impulse for expansion. Let me get over here. Here's a definition of imperialism, which I wish it wasn't so pointed, but it could be a little more generic. At the late 19th century term for colonizing foreign nations, relying on business, political, and military structures rather than settlers. That's a really a cool way of looking at it, though. Instead of colonizing with people, we colonize with our structures, with our institutions, and of course exploiting their resources. We have to kind of word it as juicy as we can, I guess, to get y'all's attention. But imperialism, remember, is expanding a nation's authority. It's a policy of expanding a nation's authority by either controlling or acquiring territory. All right, controlling or acquiring. A lot of folks will say, well, imperialism is the acquiring of land and blah, blah. Well, it's you don't have to, a country doesn't have to take the land, or a country can simply dominate. For instance, like the way we did with Cuba for the first half of the 20th century. The United States never possessed Cuba, but we definitely had dominance over Cuba. So imperialism at work, even though there was no acquisition. Beautiful map here. Look at Africa. Now look at the Caribbean. Common denominator is you got all these different countries owning pieces of each. Look down in the bottom left. All those countries, Portugal in possessions, Spain in possessions, German Empire in possessions, Russian Empire in possessions. I mean, my goodness, look at all those countries. And you can see their possessions. Look at Africa. Look at Africa. I mean, Even big West Africa is called French West Africa. Everything in Africa, they call this the partition of Africa. Everything in Africa is being controlled by a European or Asian country. I mean, look at it. I love talking about the impulse for expansion because you can get into so many different things. I'll spare you right now, but you just think about, you can get into the economy. There's economic reasons. There's military reasons. There's humanitarian reasons. Helping other people. Spreading our culture, sometimes whether they want it or not. Another impulse for expansion was, unfortunately, was keeping up with the Joneses. Expansion was in the air, so to speak. Spanish-American War, big decision to intervene. I mean, 90 miles away from Miami, we took a keen interest to take note of all those investments that American business folk had made in Cuba. How many millions of US dollars were invested into Cuba? Absolutely, we had a stake at what was going on. Cuba, one of the original Spanish colonies. Columbus himself put the Spanish flag in the ground for Spain in Cuba. Teller Amendment attached to the Declaration of War. It's an amendment to the Declaration of War saying we're not doing this to acquire Cuba for ourselves. We're doing this for the independence of Cuba, whether other nationalities believed us or not. Splendid little war. I mean, it only lasted the summer. We lost way more folks to mosquito bites than we did to bullets. Treaty of Paris. There's only 1,000,000 treaties of Paris, I guess we should say. You got to look at the year. Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War. It ended the Spanish-American War. It's going to end both world wars. So, Treaty of Paris, they're kind of a dime a dozen. You got to look at the date and see which one's which. This one, of course, ends the war with Spain, between the U.S. and Spain. And United States absolutely took Spain's colonial holdings from her. What was left of Spain's mighty colonial empire is now gone. The reason we had to buy the Philippines is because we didn't take the Philippines until after the ceasefire had been called. But the U.S. forces had already occupied Puerto Rico, Guam, of course Cuba. Platt Amendment arranges for the U.S. to have Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. Obama's talking about shutting it down. This is where we acquire that naval base in Cuba, Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. Now, upon this taking away all of Spain's colonial holdings, think about Cuba getting its independence and the Filipinos over on the other side of the globe, they expect the same thing. They want independence as well. However, President McKinley is not willing to give it to them. Now, it gets kind of sticky right here. U.S. gives Cuba its independence, but does not give the Philippine Islands its independence, or their independence. And some Filipinos are unhappy about that. Matter of fact, the freedom fighters in the Philippines who were fighting against Spain, well, they just switched enemies, so to speak, and now they're fighting the United States for independence. Here it is where we acknowledge that the U.S. is committing the sins of her fathers, because look at what we're doing. The United States has always been the symbol for colonial people fighting for its independence against a corrupt government. Well, I'm not saying our government's corrupt, but now look what's happening. The Philippines are fighting the United States for their independence, and the United States is fighting to keep the Filipinos from independence. So it's a little twist there, is it not? And it does not make a whole lot of Americans proud. I ain't saying all, but some very proud that it seems that we have now become an oppressor. We must take measures to try to make sure we are not this oppressor, because we dadgum sure look like one, if you know what I mean. This was a nasty, nasty war. And, summary executions on both sides, violent racism. We had black soldiers walk off because they wouldn't participate in such awful treatment. It wasn't that the Americans were the Lone Ranger here, it was a two-way street. Of course, the report back in the United States was that those African American soldiers done walked off, they went AWOL. Well, no, they turned their back on some practices that they would not participate in. It was very, very complicated. But anyway, we see the location of the Philippines. Look down here at French Indochina in the bottom left. That's where Vietnam is. That's where Vietnam's going to come from. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos all make up French Indochina, but we'll deal with French Indochina. We'll deal with Vietnam, of course, when we get on the other side of WW2. And here we go, Teddy Roosevelt, the great, leading the Rough Riders. No, well, he really didn't lead the Rough Riders. He was second in command, but great picture that serves his purposes. He was a really good PR man, especially when it came to himself. Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, you're right. Now check this out. Maine sailors murdered by Spain. The Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. I mean, let's come on now. Yellow journalism at its finest. Check out this campaign. The American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. But for humanity's sake. William McKinley switches VPs in the election of 1900. In 1896, Teddy Roosevelt was not VP. 1900, he will be his VP. And of course, McKinley will be assassinated and TR will ascend to the presidency. Look at the debate over colonies. Huge debate to colonize or not. again, Philippine-American War, we've already mentioned that. The white man's burden. The burden, of course, was to spread our benevolent institutions to less fortunate people. The Anglo-Saxon quest, not just American. You see, this is pretty broad ranged here. To better the lives of so-called racially inferior people by spreading our economy, our culture, our religion. Miss Filipino independence over there. Nice little shot of Uncle Sam feeding some civilization and education to the little Filipino baby. Of course, the implication is whether the baby wants it or not. And here we got Uncle Sam teaching Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Hawaiians, Filipinos. Don't forget the Hawaiians. Check out the background. Window washer. Indian back there can't read. Got it upside down. Oh yeah. Gotta analyze our competing visions. You know, this obviously was just a huge deal. Is our culture, are we actually going to do this? And now, are we going to annex the Philippines? We're going to give them their freedom. Oh my goodness, here we are making fun of us for, you know, divvying it all up. Well, I hardly know which to take first. Okay. Now, we got all this grandiose plan of increasing trade with China. But because of the way China is being dominated by other nationalities, our plan is in jeopardy. And you can't be messing with the plan. So we come up with this lovely open door policy. Try to ensure that all these other nationalities allowed us to trade in China. This exclusive political and trading rights that a foreign nation enjoyed within another nation's territory. That's what's going on in China. And then, of course, open door policy. That's our sponsored agreement to keep Chinese markets open to all foreign nations. The second part of the open door policy was that all these foreign nations pay their Chinese taxes to keep the Chinese somewhat pacified. Now let's check this map out and you can see the spheres of influence. These foreign countries do not own or possess these areas on the China coast or in China, but they control it, they dominate it. It's their sphere of influence, if you will. Germany, Japan, Great Britain, you can find those colors readily. France down, now French Indochina is a French colony. However, look up here in China, look at the Chang River and how the British kind of got that locked down. Down north of Hong Kong, well, Hong Kong and surrounding area actually looks like it's Japan. You get the point. Look up southeast of Beijing, where the Boxer Rebellion took place. A group of Chinese who didn't like all this foreign stuff going on in their country. Of course, the foreigners shut down the Boxers to continue their dominance of China. But colonial possessions and spheres of influence. Alrighty. Oh, this is pretty self-explanatory. Here we've got some Panama Canal action. You know, we've been talking about, well, people have been talking about Panama Canal since Cortez conquered the Aztecs. I mean, this isn't a new idea. So, you know, 1500s, 1600s, 17, here we are, 18, 1900s, boom, building the canal. Look at this. Look at the liberties we got to take with Mother Nature. Look at that. Can you imagine? My goodness. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, I guess. There's Teddy in his white suit. Lovely. And as your book points out, first sitting president ever to leave the country. He said he had to go down there and watch dirt fly. Roosevelt corollary. Now, here we go. The corollary to the 1823 Monroe Doctrine that announced the U.S. intention to act as an international police power in Latin America. Alright. Monroe Doctrine 1823. That is the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy to this day. You hear me? The cornerstone. It was in 1823. President Monroe told European countries that the Western Hemisphere, our side of the globe, is no longer available for European colonization. If European countries possess a colony, they can keep it. We're not going to roll it back, but there will be no further colonization in the Americas. Capiche? Now, that's a pretty gutsy statement. He also said there will be no European intervention in the affairs of countries in the Western Hemisphere, and vice versa. There will be no interference in European affairs by American governments. So, Monroe, drawing the line, no further colonization. Now, I, for one, am very thankful that these European countries didn't all get together and decide to come over here and administer a swift attitude adjustment, because they'd have probably kicked our butts up between our ears, but it didn't happen. So we ain't going to spend any more time talking about it. Let's move on. Roosevelt corollary adds to that cornerstone. So the cornerstone, Monroe Doctrine, said there will be no further colonization. There will be no further intervention. And then the Roosevelt corollary announces the U.S. intention of acting as an international police. Well, what Roosevelt said, and get this down real quick, what Roosevelt said is that the United States will intervene in Latin American affairs if a country proves unable or unwilling to maintain peace. Unable to maintain peace or unwilling to maintain peace. The problem can come internally or externally. Unwilling or unable to maintain peace. The United States will intervene. Now, Roosevelt exempted he exempted 3 Latin American countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, because Roosevelt thought those 3 were, quote, civilized enough to take care of themselves, to take care of their own affairs. But the rest of Latin American affairs, not civilized enough. We will intervene. We will be big brother. We will take care of little brother, little sister, if you know what I mean. Roosevelt corollary. Very, very interesting as we step up our international presence. Wonderful, most famous of all pictures. Teddy carrying the big stick in the Caribbean, toting the U.S. Navy, the Great White Fleet behind him, receiver, debt collector, the big stick in the Caribbean. The results here, look at Haiti, Dominican Republic, both protectorates. Look at all that intervention, all the occupation. Panama, protectorate. A protectorate is a smaller country being protected by a larger country. A protectorate is a weak country that depends on a larger country for its protection, and there's usually some kind of a relationship there. You know the relationship down in Panama with the canal. But look at your island, Dominican and Haiti, Dominican Republic and Haiti. Okay, protectorate with both, occupied both. This is the result of the Roosevelt corollary. The United States will intervene if a Latin American country proves unable or unwilling to maintain peace on its own. And here we're going to wrap the chapter up with a little economy, a little trade. You notice United States trade still by far with Europe. The Americas are secondary, and Asia remains in third as far as volume, millions of dollars of trade. All right.